everybody. Let's get to it. This is the Nostalgia Trap podcast. My name is David Parsons. I thank you so much for tuning into the show. This week, my guest is Freddie deBoer. Many of you probably know him as a writer and academic, someone who writes a lot about the left and American politics in general. He has appeared in a million different publications. I'm talking like big stuff like New York Times and Harper's and a million other places. But he's also, has a blog that you can find at frederickdeboer.com. And the blog, I think I've probably read the blog the most, and I talked to him a lot about what his kind of intention was in creating the blog, what he sees as his role on the left. And I discovered, something that I've probably found out about many of the guests on this show, is that he has deep family roots on the left, something that I do not have. As many of you know, and I talk about on the show all the time, that I come from a family that's not really super political. But I found that so many of the guests that show up here have these like kind of deep roots in their family being involved in left and progressive causes, and that's certainly the case with Freddie deBoer. He also is someone who really writes a lot about and thinks a lot about the politics of the college campus, and I talked to him a little bit about why that's such a kind of a personal part, an important part of his politics in general, and it made me think a lot about kind of my own place in the academy, and how for me the left has been found in the universities. That's where I've made contact with that. In other words, instead of it being like a part of my family, I've found a left family, both as an undergrad and in grad school, among professors and among other students. And that's been the place where activism and politics has existed for me. And I think talking to Freddie, it kind of clarified how kind of important that place is as a generator of ideas, and why we should take the politics that emerges from college campuses, both undergraduates and graduates and faculty, very seriously. So we had a great conversation. I really enjoyed talking to Freddie. I hope you enjoy hearing us speak together. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the show. You can find more episodes at nostalgiatrap.com. Like, share on Twitter, Facebook, all the other social media stuff. I appreciate it. Enjoy this conversation. This is me talking with Freddie deBoer. Writing on your blog is you are kind of a polemicist, kind of a bomb thrower. I mean, sometimes I have to say, sometimes I'm reading your writing and I'm thinking, finally someone says it. Finally someone, and I want to spread it to everyone. And sometimes I'll read your writing and I'm like, this guy. Did that ever scare you to realize that you're writing things that some people are going to like and some people are not going to like? Or is that something that you've gotten over?
Well, I mean, I probably have rendered myself unemployable, so I guess it scares me in a sort of practical way. I get a lot of what has happened periodically throughout the 8 years or so that I've done this is I'll get a reader who is really intensely into my stuff, and they'll send me emails and they'll just be telling me about how, I mean, I get a ton of emails that actually mean a lot to me, that just sort of say, thank you for saying something that I need you to say. And I get a lot of that. But what will happen is sometimes people will sort of fall in love, and then I'll publish something and it won't kind of hit them in the same way that the other things hit them, or in fact, like they'll just actively disagree with it. And then it's like a sense of betrayal for people.
Yeah.
Because
I think I've felt that sense of betrayal, not necessarily with your stuff, but with many writers, right. That you feel like, you feel close to, and then it feels like, God, I thought they were on my side. I thought they thought exactly the way I do.
Right. So there's a real intimacy that comes from when somebody expresses something that you have had trouble articulating yourself, and when that person says it, and then you feel like, wow, like this is a very kind of vulnerable moment. And then when that person then believes something you think is really shitty, then that kind of creates a sense of betrayal.
Yeah, it hurts, and it makes you. It's interesting because it actually has made me. I mean, this is a source of a lot of tension between friends on the left, and I'm sure on the right too. But it's like the feeling like I can't be friends with you anymore because you've said that. It's almost like I'm more hurt by this small little digression from my politics than I am hurt by someone on the other side.
Right. I mean, the thing is I write a lot that's sort of critical of like the signaling function of politics or the performative function of politics. The thing is, like, I don't mean to imply that has no value. I mean, we do have to, as human beings, kind of sort ourselves into kind of ethical units in order to just get along with each other. And that is also an inevitable part of politics, right? I never blame people for that. What happens a lot is that I'll have one person sort of stick up for me, and then other people will say sort of like, that guy has to be out, right? Like, and right. You can't, like, you're defending that guy is something that is like a real problem between us. And one of the things that I wish people, I wish people would be more willing to sort of like say, like, we all are never going to have perfectly overlapping Venn diagrams, right? Mm-hmm. And so, like, we have to, like, you don't have to like me, but don't sort of take liking me as a thing that disqualifies someone else for your friendship.
Right, right. Yeah. I mean, and do you find Twitter? I mean, Twitter. You're pretty active on Twitter, aren't you?
Unfortunately,
yeah. And you know what's funny is everyone I talk to that is active on Twitter has that exact same reaction. They kind of like, oh, unfortunately, I'm active on Twitter. Like this, it's kind of like lamenting that you're part of it. Like, what is it that you're lamenting? Like, what is it that's bad or poisonous about Twitter that you're locating there?
It's like, it turns out, I mean, I don't know if you've ever heard the term digital dualist, which is like a critique of the idea that there's a difference between our online selves and our IRL selves. Mm-hmm. And I just am a digital dualist. Like, I think that, like, human beings, it's really important, like eye contact. It turns out it's like really important,
right?
Or like just physical presence. Yeah. So they do these studies. So I read about a study once, and they're trying to figure out road rage, right? And so they studied pedestrians first, and they say why. I mean, every once in a while people bump into each other on the street and get mad, but it's not nearly as prevalent as like road rage is,
right?
But what they sort of observed in pedestrians is, people make kind of nonverbal apologies to each other all the time in that space. You cut in front of somebody, you realize that you've done it, and you sort of have this look that both people can kind of register in an instant. And very quickly, like, you give sorry about that, and then you give back the signal, the nonverbal signal of it's okay. And that happens completely involuntarily and in the matter of like less than a second, right? And then when they look at like road rage, you can't physically see the other person in the car most of the time. And even if you can see their form, you can't see their face, right? And so one of the things that the car does is it takes away like that way in which we kind of extend sort of social graces to each other, kind of in an embodied way. And the Twitter is just like removing all of that and just giving a kind of like abrasive side of our minds and our brains and sort of rubbing against each other all the time.
Yeah, like it's in that metaphor, it's like an ideological freeway, with everyone trapped within these kind of Twitter profiles that are invested in kind of putting out certain points of view. I think that I've lived in LA and New York, and there is a big difference socially between being physically present with people and being in cars. I mean, and what's scary about it is it's like it happens to me too. Like I get in the car and I hate everybody,
right.
And it comes out in a really, really intense and projected way. Projecting everything I have inside onto them. So I want to go back a little bit on like kind of how this happened to you, like how you ended up being a writer and an academic and someone who throws bombs on your blog and on Twitter. And when I say throw bombs, I mean that in a really good way. We live in a time where we could use a little more of that. But where are you from originally?
So I grew up in Middletown, Connecticut. I actually grew up on the campus of Wesleyan University in the late 80s and early 90s, and my father was a theater professor there.
Okay.
Yeah, it's fun. I often tell people that like the only two options for me were to be a complete commie like I am, or to be just an arch reactionary. Because
right.
Everything about my background prepared me to be a leftist. So my father was a big lefty. He wasn't really politically active, but he was very politically conscious. He was a theater professor at a notoriously sort of free-thinking liberal campus. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie PCU.
Yes.
That movie was written by one of my father's students, and it is
wow.
It is based on where I grew up. That was my environment growing up. My mother was a local, she was like a crazy free spirit. I mean, she used to play like naked badminton and stuff like that. And she was a local environmental activist who saved a lot of the local wilderness from the state and the developers and stuff like that. My grandfather was a socialist and anti-war professor of education in the UIUC system. He was actually the subject of what were called the Broyles Bills, which were local state McCarthyist bills in Illinois, where he was specifically named as like a subversive and a commie.
Wow, I had no idea this was part of your history.
Yeah, and then my grandmother on my father's side was herself a civil rights and ACLU activist. In fact, they named the local ACLU prize after her after she died. My mother's parents were kind of sort of traditionally Union Democrat, liberals from Connecticut. So, and then my father, before he ever came to Wesleyan, he lived here for 10 years, and he was a director in the black box theater scene. And you can imagine, this was the late 60s, early 70s. So on the one hand, it's sort of the mean streets era. I mean, he got stabbed in a mugging and stuff like that. But it was also, I grew up around, ex-junkies and drag queens. And so for like a lot of people that I know, like, they didn't really sort of catch on to the existence of gay people until they were like, in their teen years.
Right. Whenever Will and Grace came on TV.
Right, exactly. And I just I grew up around the kind of queer people who hated marriage, right? The gay marriage thing was weird for me because these were the kind of people who complain about breeders and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. By the time that the gay movement comes to the mainstream, it's packaged in marriage,
right?
Yeah.
So then that was my context, and growing up around all these crazy poets and anarchists and kind of people, and those people paid a high price. Like a lot of them are gone now. A lot of them died of AIDS or got cancer. They didn't really take care of themselves, that sort of thing. But it was a really remarkable way to grow up, and it was just my context was just kind of radical. So
yeah, and it seems like you're right. You're right. That could go either way, right? And it seems like you could turn into a young Republican that way very easily.
Exactly. Yeah.
So how did you come to? It sounds like you're surrounded by this politics. I mean, was there a point when you were in school that you thought, "Oh, this is who I am," and I know a little bit more of like kind of my own politics, or did you feel like it was kind of handed to you?
Well, the essential sort of life thing that happened is that my parents both died. My mother got brain cancer when I was 7, and my father got liver cancer when I was 15.
Wow.
In between the time, my father had remarried to a woman that I never got along with. And so after he died, it got really bad. And so the family just sort of split up, and it was a wearying kind of 5 or 6 years of like fighting about the will and the money. And, and so me and my siblings for a long while, they really had nothing, and so I was sort of taking care of myself. At that time I was, 16. And that kind of took a politics that had been kind of theoretical, and kind of actualized it in some ways. But it showed me just sort of how much capacity for callousness our system has, And then, of course, as time went on, I sort of learned more and more about like people from marginalized groups and how that kind of experience, how common that is for people who don't enjoy some of my advantages. But that also was sort of probably the origin of some of my critiques of privilege politics also, because I think that privilege politics sort of elides that kind of experience as well. So,
well, can you explain that a little bit more? What you mean by that? Because I mean, privilege politics is something that is part of I think part of the discussion of what's going on in politics now. But at the time, I mean, how is that kind of making an impact on how you're thinking?
Sure. So it's like. There are people in the world who would find what I just did offensive in kind of placing my experience, my struggle, after my parents died, on a spectrum with people of color or women or queer people.
Right.
So there's a sense that however unfortunate the details of my background, my coming from a dominant identity, being a straight white dude, that means that I am permanently sort of removed from that sort of spectrum of oppression. Right. And I think that is not an effective way to think about politics strategically. And I also think, I 100% agree that even when things were worse for me, I benefited from privilege. And I have all kinds of sort of institutional advantages that have helped me again and again in my life. But when I was a, 19-year-old with nobody, suffering from undiagnosed manic depression and sort of struggling with nothing, the fact that I had all those privileges was not a very salient aspect of my life.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And there's an inability within the privileged discourse to say both things, right?
Right. It's like the privileged discourse is a hammer, essentially,
right,
used for basically flattening and eliminating a point of view.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so it's like on the one hand, like you see these images from like 4chan or whatever on the internet of a white homeless guy sleeping on a bench, and it's like, and there'll be captions like, "Oh, look at all this guy's white privilege." Right. That's dumb, right? Because in a certain real sense, that guy does have white privilege, right? But what's also dumb is the people who don't see that, like when he's on the bench and suffering from mental illness or alcoholism or whatever. His white privilege is not a very salient element of his life at that moment.
Right.
And so there's a kind of mutual misunderstanding about about the actual theory of privilege, even though people talk about it and think about it all the time, in my opinion.
And you can be a very privileged person and also like a total victim of capitalism at the same time.
Right.
So at what point does like education and school enter your mind as a direction for you? Because I mean, I felt like when I was in high school, it felt like, okay, I'm going to go to college just like everybody else. But at a certain point, in undergrad, it felt like I was going to go to graduate school. And it seemed like that would be the direction for me. When did that happen for you?
Sure. So to begin with, from my first semester of undergrad, I went to a college in Hawaii. So I should say that I never went a semester of high school without failing at least one subject. I actually didn't walk with my graduating class because I had to take summer school to finish. So I had terrible grades. So I didn't have a lot of options. And I got to this sort of like, really just a picture of like a bullshit college in the tropics, And at the time, the idea was that, I mean, I didn't really articulate it to myself, but I'm sure the idea was like, that was as far away from my stepmother as I could imagine going, was to Hawaii.
Right.
So I went out there, and predictably, it was a total disaster. It was super expensive, and I didn't make any friends. So I quit, and I moved back home. And then I started taking classes at the local community college, and I ended up getting my degree at a school called Central Connecticut State, which is like a sort of like a comprehensive public university, like a non-competitive one. And I kind of did it because I didn't have much other idea of what I wanted to do. I applied for grad school like in literature right out of there, and didn't get in anywhere, which is good because I had no idea what I was doing. I mean, I didn't know what grad school was or whatever. And so then I took a few years, like I lived in Chicago for a few years, and just did a string of meaningless jobs. Like, I walked dogs, and I painted racquetball courts for the YMCA, just, whatever I could get.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then what ended up happening was, I decided it was time to get a real job. So I went back to Connecticut, and I was on the job market for 2 years, and I got nothing. I mean, it was right, this was 2008 or whatever, 2009, so you can imagine the employment scene wasn't the best.
And what were you looking for at the time?
I was literally looking for almost anything.
Yeah.
Like I would have taken a job at like Geico or whatever.
Yeah.
And I ended up getting like a couple of authors that weren't much more money than a grad student stipend was for terrible soul crushing work. So I figured, well, what the hell? I'll get my master's. So I went to the University of Rhode Island and got my master's there in writing and rhetoric. And I kind of discovered a love for applied linguistics, and I went to Purdue, and I just finished my PhD there last year. But I started my first blog, now defunct. I started in 2008, and that was I actually literally started it. It was like a Blogspot blog, which I started at a library computer, a public computer at the library, and I had been there doing job apps. Again, for just soul crushing, like sending out job applications, and I read something by Matt Iglesias, and I thought it was good, and so I wrote a post about it, and that's how I started. Yeah.
What was the impulse to be public that way, to kind of engage with the public? I mean, someone asked me the other day like why I started this podcast, and I was kind of like, I'm not sure what the goal was. Part of it is just kind of I part of just wanted to record, literally record my thoughts and the thoughts of people that I respect, and kind of figure out what's going on. But what is it for you?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, I just had nothing good going on in my life, sort of. I had no money, and a girl that I had been dating and I broke up after like 4.5 years. And I was like living at my sister's house with no sort of future, and I figured, well, what the hell? I might as try to do something. And I can write a little bit, You
can write more than a little bit, dude.
Thanks.
You're like a very, very prolific guy. I mean, you write, and I think I read an interview with you. You write something like 18,000 words a week or something like that. Yeah. I mean, what is the process? Like, in part, like, do you get up in the morning and are instantly at your computer writing all the time? Are you a late night writer? Do you go to coffee shops? How do you do this? Because it takes me a long time to write.
So I always, when people ask me like, what's my best advice for writing a lot, I always tell them, from what really works well for me is having drug-resistant insomnia and bipolar disorder. That's a really great combination if you want to write a lot.
Get that at Dwayne Reed.
The thing is the process of writing a lot, for me anyway, is also the process of getting good. This is sort of gets into my kind of academic identity. I have lots of problems with how writing is taught, like on the college level. And one of the problems is writing is an iterative process. Like becoming a good writer is just repetition, right? Like
playing a musical instrument.
It's exactly like playing a musical instrument. You do it again, and you get good. But you have to pump out words all the time. And the other thing for me is just that, like, not to sound pretentious, but I genuinely write because of a feeling like I just can't sit still until I express something that I'm feeling. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten out of bed in the middle of the night to write a post because I'm so consumed by the thought at the time,
right?
Which I'm sure isn't healthy. But
it's a need to externalize something in some way.
Yeah, exactly.
I tell my students that all the time, that they need to write a lot in order, because there is a feeling like students will write one paper during the semester. It's kind of a bizarre idea. Right. Like they'll write one or two papers and just tell them what to write and expect that it will be a piece of research journalism or something. And it seems like a really it's more of a process. And like,
I mean, I tell people all the time that
that's right.
I tell people all the time that I actually think that like the level of prose chops right now that just is out there is actually really, really high. Like I think that people can actually really write right now. And I think the reason for that is one of the things that the internet affords you the opportunity to do is to put something out and receive immediate feedback, then put something out again, right? So you're in this feedback loop. So you send something out and people like it or don't, or they identify problems with it, and then you do it again. And like that kind of self-reinforcing process, like you get a little better and a little better, and a little better.
It's almost like being in a class in that context, right. Like kind of like writing, getting immediate kind of like a peer response, and then either adjusting or whatever you got to do to move forward. And it seems like a good way to either get caught in that feedback loop or grow from it.
Right. But you have to listen is one of the things. You have to be willing to be criticized, and you have to actually pay attention to it. Yeah.
Right. And that's a hard thing to do, I think, in a media environment that's very much invested in kind of like being right all the time and all that kind of stuff. Well, I mean, speaking of like in terms of like the actual what you're writing about, was there like, it sounds like you started your blog in like 2009, 2008, somewhere around there. I mean, that's right when Obama is kind of taking over the country as president and moving into this era that now I think we're seeing a kind of big reaction to in a lot of ways. Was that part of what you were aiming at? Was it like something political that was happening in the larger world that made you want to write about it?
So it's really funny because my reputation now is, I mean, depending on how sympathetic the person is either as like a sort of left-wing reformer, like a left-on-left critic who always criticizes left people. Some people see that as sort of like a hidden or a coded conservatism, like I'm a Manchurian candidate or something. When I started, for years, the reputation I had was leftier than thou. I mean, the criticism of me for years and years was not that I was a left-wing critic of other left-wing people, but that I was the person who was always trying to be leftmost. So
like positioning yourself as some sort of like pure leftist.
Right.
At least that's how people were reading your stuff.
Or to the left of the kind of DC wonks of that era. I mean, the thing, and so it's like, it's so funny for me when people say, oh, now like you're a closet conservative. That's like the opposite of what people said a few years ago. The thing is, I don't think people recognize, online culture changes gradually, and so it's hard to sort of keep your eye on sort of what's changing. But when I started, the sort of center of gravity was very much in DC, and it was with kind of, liberal to neoliberal bloggers like Matt Iglesias and Ezra Klein. And then you had the sort of libertarian wing with like Julian Sanchez and Megan McArdle. And that the conversation, the center of the conversation has shifted from DC politics to kind of New York City kind of cultural kind of writing. Like if you take the sort of default sort of like person with an audience and a well-known name on the internet, when I started, it was like a kind of wonky kind of person who lived in the Beltway and was really invested in politics specifically. And now it's kind of a postgraduate, like, sort of post-college graduate, cultural studies kind of inflected pop culture writer who lives in Brooklyn, right?
And works for like the Gawker Network or something
Works
like
for
that.
Gawker or BuzzFeed or,
which isn't politics, but we can get to Gawker, but like because Gawker's moving to pure politics now. At least that's what they're saying.
Supposedly,
but I feel like I know what you're saying a little bit. Is it's kind of like it's culture writers that are then dipping into politics from a cultural angle,
right? And so one of the things that's happened is, it's not as though the center has moved left to me. It's that the vocabulary has shifted in a way. So I didn't like the politics, obviously, of a kind of the sort of neoliberals who were sort of dominating the left wing. I mean, one of the first things I ever wrote that got a real lot of attention was where I said at the time, look, there is no left wing to the online politics conversation. I mean, Jacobin didn't exist. The New Inquiry didn't exist. Dissent was at that point in its full-out kind of anti-communist stage. The Nation had been marginalized. Like there wasn't like a sort of vocal left wing like there is now. I mean, this was pre-financial crisis, right? And so I said, like, look, we have shading from sort of liberal squishy types like Matt Iglesias, who has since moved right, I think, or an Ezra Klein, who's more of a kind of technocrat kind of than a bomb thrower. Then going towards like the crazy conservatives. Now it's, there's a very deep kind of radicalism in language, but that to me is married to not a very challenging kind of actual politics. And so the way that you show off your kind of lefty credentials now is that you use a certain vocabulary that you learn reading bell hooks at Vassar, and that you then apply to an essay about Rihanna, right? And that's how you kind of say that you're a real lefty. And I think that just as it was in the 2008, 2009, 2010 era, we have a fundamental imbalance going on right now. It's a different kind of imbalance. So my reputation has kind of changed in relation to that, but I haven't changed.
Yes, right. Okay, that's interesting because it's like you're basically saying that it's the conversation has changed and in that. Ironically repositioned you,
right?
Yeah. And part of it has to do with college campuses, right? You write something a lot about like what's going on college campuses. Is that like a community that you feel invested in, the college students?
I mean, it's always been my community, right?
Yeah.
Like I said, I literally grew up on campus at Wesleyan,
right?
And I've been on college campuses now for 7 years as a grad student. I mean, for the vast majority of my life, I've been on a college campus.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, part of this is that I watched the PCU kids, right? The super passionate activists from Wesleyan in the early 90s. I mean, most of those people didn't go full out Republican, right? But what they did do is they kind of adopted the sort of apoliticism and sort of like soccer mom apoliticism, or like very kind of mushy and vague, like Obama, great kind of politics, right? Like those people were passionate and they had a lot of great ideas, and I respect them, but their vision of the political future failed, right? And I'm seeing so many of the same mistakes happening on campus right now. So it always comes from my perception that their goals are good, but they have no idea how to kind of sort of implement those goals in a real world sort of way.
Right. I mean, it seems like when I see what's going on at different college campuses around identity politics and things like that, and kind of extreme sensitivity about what we would call PC language and language policing and stuff like that. It seems like it happens more like the further you go up towards the elite colleges. Right. Like it happens less. Like I'm a CUNY person. We don't have a lot of that going on at CUNY, but I see a little more of it at NYU, and then at schools like Rutgers, et cetera, you're going to see like even more of it. Right. It seems like I feel like I might have been. I'm sympathetic to students like that because I maybe was one of those students in the sense of like, I was a suburban privileged kid that read Howard Zinn in college, and all of a sudden I'm like I'm outraged about racism in the society, etc. And I had a very kind of simplistic view about not only what that meant, but also kind of what was the appropriate response to it.
Right.
Not that I mean, Howard Zinn is kind of is like a step along a political evolution in some sense. I feel like a lot of students don't get much further than that. Well, I mean, you described it as bell hooks, but I think it's a similar kind of approach, right? Yeah,
I mean, so I guess one thing to sort of add to the biographical element here is, So I was in college. I was an undergrad. Like I said, I took a year or two off, and so I was an undergrad in 2002, 2003, 2004. And there I joined the Progressive Student Alliance at my college. And again, my college is not competitive. Like there's it is 75%, or was anyway, 75% commuter, including me. Many of the students were adult students who worked during the day and went to school at night.
Right.
And that
totally different environment.
Yeah, and that lended activism a certain. I don't want to romanticize it. I mean, there are problems with that, but it lended activism a certain kind of brute pragmatism. And so I got involved in local anti-war politics that way. I became at one point like a 30-hour-a-week anti-Iraq war activist, and put together some, helped with groups like Cut Up, which was Connecticut United for Peace, which I think is defunct now, and the local trans advocacy group, and put together some really amazing anti-war events, But and then also the group I was part of blew up, even with the sort of advantages that we had from coming from a working class campus, it devolved into red baiting and factionalism and secret meetings and loyalty oaths.
Jesus.
And, so here's a story if you don't mind me telling.
Yeah, go for it.
So,
I love this internal left politics stuff. It's so weird.
So, I hate the idea of consensus-based decision-making.
Twinkle fingers? You're not a twinkle finger
I'm
guy?
not a twinkle finger guy. It's really popular in college.
Yeah.
The thing is consensus means everybody thinks the same thing, and that's bad.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's what fascism is, right? Like it's the fascists are the ones who want perfect consensus. We want internal dissent.
And it's not democracy, ironically.
Right.
And even though it's kind of maybe intended to be a gesture towards democracy.
Well, so I'm in this group, and the people within it decide, well, we want to switch to a consensus sort of decision-making system. And I articulated the case against it, and I said, look, number one, like people say that this is to respect everybody's opinion, but what ends up happening is the group can't move forward as long as there's dissenters. So the dissenters feel overwhelming pressure to shut up, right? What actually happens in those groups. So there's a couple of possibilities. Number one, everybody is so similar in their demographics and in their background that they do agree on everything. Like it doesn't surprise me if the Sterile Lawrence Anti-Sweatshop League, if everybody there who who went to a private school and has parents who make $80,000 a year, it doesn't surprise me if they all have the same exact politics, and so they can get along with consensus. But if you have any kind of actual internal diversity in your group, which is what you want, people will disagree. But then if people do disagree, you can't function when there's like actual repeated disagreement.
Yeah.
So anyway, the group has this debate for days. It gets ugly, it gets contentious, and you start to see the stuff that happens to left organizing all the time, which is you get questioning of people's motives. You get people saying, "Oh, are you a plant? Or you look like an FBI agent," which I used to get. I used to get that all the time in my organizing days. Why are you trying to hurt the group? We're going to have a secret meeting for supporters. Well, now we're going to have like a secret vote. So then what ends up happening is somebody says, "Okay." I said in discussion, well, look, clearly I'm the one of the few dissenters on this. Let's just vote, and you guys will win, and we'll switch to a consensus decision-making system. And he said, no, this is so important. We need to use consensus to establish consensus.
I knew that was coming.
I said, hold on a second. Like we don't yet have it. How can you just sort of impose that by
over consensus?
Right.
Sure.
And they said, no, it's got to be consensus. And so I said, okay, I'm never going to consent to this because I don't think it's a good idea. And we had 3 days, 3 meetings, successive meetings of discussion. And every time we would come to have the consensus, and I ended up, at first it was me and a few other people. They all eventually either got religion or they left. But I would show up and I would say no. And then so finally, quietly after one of the meetings, someone said, we've talked it over and we don't think you should go to the meetings anymore.
Yeah, there's a consensus over us not wanting you here anymore.
Right, so they established consensus by removing the dissenting voice.
Right. And blow that up to like larger politics and it sounds insane.
Right, and the thing is like that, like the whole movement, their rationale was that we want to respect everyone's voice. But when you have the consensus system, you either have completely intractable situations like this or you remove the dissenting voice.
Yeah.
That's obviously kind of like an extreme sort of situation example, but that is the basic problem with these completely horizontal organizations.
And that's what was going on at Occupy Wall Street.
Right.
Occupy was a national movement, I only went to Zuccotti Park to like kind of bear witness to what was going on there, and that seemed to be the kind of general attitude was like we need to all agree on before we do anything, and I guess if you take that to its logical extreme, that means we're going to eventually eliminate the people that don't agree with us, and eliminate, however, just kick them out. They're not going to be part of the movement, which seems like a really bad way of building a politics.
And it's also, I mean, it always involves people telling lies to themselves, right? So, the myth of even if I thought it was a good idea, like completely horizontal organizing, the idea of complete leaderlessness, that never is going to exist, right? Even if your group is ostensibly without leaders, some people are going to talk more often, get more done. I mean, like I said, I was going to anti-war organizing meetings in Hartford. I would have spent the previous week, we were trying to get permits from the city for this march. And so I went to the Department of Licensure and Inspection, and they sent me to the cops. And then the cops sent me to the Department of Sanitation, and then they sent me to the mayor's office. Because the thing is like when establishment power, if they're smart, if they really want to stop an event like this, they never just say no. They just bury you in red tape, right?
Yeah.
And so I was spending hours and hours of my life. Like I was going and like trying to reserve fucking porta potties. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And then you'd go to a meeting and there'd be a guy there who you had seen maybe once before in the previous 3 months, and because of the doctrine of leaderlessness, his opinion would be expected to count as much as mine, right? Mm-hmm. Which, number one, turns people off from organizing because they say, why should we do work if work is not respected? But number two, like it just sort of depends on this lie that like I wasn't actually a leader. I was a leader practically, even if I didn't have a title.
Right.
And so,
like I got the porta potties, dude.
Right. It's like, and that's the thing is like organizing is work, like activism is work.
Yes, it is.
You have to actually like have people who actually like fucking go and do it. Right.
Right.
And so, it's called organizing, and organization implies an organization, which is a hierarchy. Establishment power loves horizontal leadership structures. They love leaderlessness because look at Occupy. You couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
Right? Anybody could show up and say the stupidest shit in the world. Like I still hear about like, oh well, there were infiltrators from the NYPD who were intentionally doing this stuff.
CIA, black blocs, all sorts of shit going on there.
So
who knows?
I would not at all put it past the NYPD to have fake protesters at Zuccotti Park.
They almost don't need them, though.
They don't need them, right? Because there's some guy who needs to stop the lizard men, or the anarcho-syndicalists who think the really radical action is to smash that Starbucks window.
It's actually surprising how many of the lizard people showed up to Occupy. It was
a convention.
Wow, this is like quite a movement of people that believe that reptiles control the world.
It was a lizard convention. Yeah, the LaRouche's got in there. And that's the thing, like you have to make activism involves, and politics in general involves making decisions, and defining who and what you are, and the constant interplay. Like, look, I get it, right? Like, you only have to look at the history of America's unions to know why people want leaderlessness, right? Mm-hmm. Like, if you look at Richard Trumka, the head of the AFL-CIO, excuse me, the guy is just a craven Democrat, and the union leaderships are why people get into horizontal organizing, because they say these systems are completely corrupt and the rank and file can't do anything. So I get it, but the horizontal thing, it is so popular on campuses, and it is such a fundamental mistake.
Makes me wonder if maybe there could be a leader app that could coordinate everything, and you could achieve leaderlessness by having kind of a robot run thing. Maybe that's another show.
Skynet,
something like that. I wanted to make sure we talk a little bit about the presidential election. I know it's kind of for me, the part of it is it's annoying to have to talk about the presidential election every 4 years, because it becomes that's what how most Americans experience politics.
Right.
Is just kind of through this monstrous corporate show. But you tweeted something recently that resonated with me, and you even I think contained an apology in the tweet. Sorry if this offends, but it's something that has been bothering me, which is kind of liberal idea and liberal smugness around the idea of Trump as this like rising Hitlerian Nazi figure, and this kind of like, we are experiencing the Third Reich, and this is exactly how it happened in 1933. That language is starting to really bother me. But why did you tweet that, and why is it bothering you?
Sure, it bothers me because it's not fucking true, right? Like it's like the material objective conditions of 2016 America are not nearly the same as the material objective conditions of 1933 Germany, right? And the thing is none of the people who say this actually think that like, you know, Trump will become president and we're going to conquer Mexico the next day, right? And that difference matters. Like part of the reason why the Holocaust happened was because it was wartime and they had all kinds of emergency powers. And, you know, and I also, look, I 100% understand why people are scared of this. I don't think we're going to have American Kristallnacht tomorrow. Like that's not the problem that confronts us. I mean, one of the things that would have happened, I mean, you know, people got fucking killed for protesting Nazis. You know what I'm saying? And as much as the sort of violence coming out of Trump supporters is detestable, it's also kind of sad, right? Like that guy punching a protester is a piece of shit and he should be arrested. But like that is to me a indication of just total weakness, right? Like the fact that you're the guy in the cowboy hat throwing a punch at a black guy in a Trump rally, which of course has far more power for the anti-Trump side than for Trump, right? You know, fascism is a problem, obviously, but it has proven to be a fragile ideology, right? Well, I mean, we have not had, I mean, depending on if you want to talk about like, totalitarian states like North Korea, but like fascism does not currently exist as like a proud ideology that people rally behind. Yeah. Even the really fascist parties, and they're actually fascist, like UKIP in the United Kingdom, or the various national fronts and stuff out there. They're fascist and they scare me, but they don't claim fascism, right? Because fascism is something that nobody wants. They always say they're not fascist, right? And that matters, right? Like neoliberalism has proven to be a far more durable ideology than fascism. Yeah. And to me, just making predictions, I could be wrong. I could always be wrong. The horror that we have in front of us is not the horror of like an actual American fascism where Muslims are being rounded up and put into camps. The horror is the status quo, right? Where Muslims are marginalized, surveilled, sent to Guantanamo, where we where we constantly invade their nations, where we destabilize their governments, right? That's
where we infiltrate their churches with law enforcement officers, and all that happens kind of invisibly under the radar. It's almost like if there were an actual situation of internment camps that might actually mobilize people to stop it, and because no one's mobilized to stop it. I mean, I wouldn't say no one. There have been obviously people doing action on this throughout the Bush and Obama administrations, but at the same time, it's happened under the radar, a lot of it, and it's still happening. And so I think it's important to underline what you just said, which is kind of like the nightmare is the status quo in a lot of ways.
Right, and that's the most likely outcome of this election, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, President Drone is also President Hope and Change, right? Like, I get it. It's the things that Donald Trump says about Muslims are unconscionable. President Obama kills children with drones, right? President Obama expanded the war of operations into places like Yemen and other places in northern Africa. And it's a kind of self-flattering kind of a thing to say, I'm standing against literal fascism right now. It's a kind of romanticized look at your own efforts. But the most likely result of this campaign has always been, right, that we continue to have a kind of neoliberal consensus. We have grinding inequality. We have a system that's set up to perpetuate the class hierarchy, right? That is the most likely outcome of this election, no matter who's elected, including Bernie, by the way.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And, that is the real danger that we have to confront. And I look, I totally get it. I don't at all have a problem with the protesters. Look, when you are in a live situation and there's this guy saying these things and you protest and disrupt his rally, I think that's great.
Yeah.
But the analytical idea that, like, this just literally is 1933 Germany, no, it's not. You don't actually think it is. And, like, the idea that it is more to do about, like, you kind of trying to make yourself seem like a romantic revolutionary figure than actually confronting the actual problems we have in front of us.
And a lot of the people I think that are saying that, including Louis C.K., who wrote an email a couple weeks ago, is basically saying exactly this point, that Trump is a Nazi and we have to stop him. There are a lot of those people are Obama supporters,
right?
And are people and it's people like that I want to, basically turn on YouTube and let's watch a tape of forced feedings at Guantanamo, and understand that your president is approving this and is part of this and is driving a lot of this, and that's to me just a hypocrisy that's too much to take, but at the same time not unexpected, because it's like Godwin's law, right? Like Nazi shows up and that like kills the argument, and it seems like, you know, if they're going to mobilize this Nazi metaphor, it's very much for the general election. It's very much to kind of say that, you know, we have to do anything, including vote for Hillary Clinton.
I mean, one of the things that capitalism does is it perpetually produces political crises that then when you solve the crisis, right, you're left back at the status quo, which you can then represent as victory, even though it's the same old shit, right? So, and that's not like me being conspiratorial. I'm not saying that like there's some cabal of bankers somewhere who like mobilized Trump to defend neoliberalism. I am saying that like,
they were reptiles, not bankers.
Right, that's right. We can predict that in the system that we have, demagogues and monsters are going to crop up.
Sure.
And then so this November, if Hillary Clinton beats Trump, people will say, we did it, we beat fascism, right? And like, okay,
right.
Congratulations.
Big national pat on the back.
Right, congratulations, we're back where we started. I mean, the perfect example of this is George W. Bush and Barack Obama.
Yeah.
Bush was awful. I mean, everything about his presidency was terrible, right? And it was a crisis. And then the crisis ended, and everybody, you know, people are crying and making out in the park in Chicago in 2008, and it's hope and change. And I was all about it. Like, I wrote dozens of blog posts, like, Obama's amazing. And
Did you delete those, or are they still up?
They're on my old blog, which it has been deleted. Yeah, so I did not delete them specifically. Because, in fact, like
that's what's hard about being a bomb thrower. It's like you're gonna be like, God damn it! Like no, it was something I wrote a month ago. I'm embarrassed by.
Well, it's useful because it would be useful for me to have them because I get accused all the time by Democrats of being a Naderite who never says to vote for Democrats. And in fact, I told people to vote for Obama. But the thing is like hope and change led to a economic team full of people that had a hand in the financial crisis.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Hope and change led to drones rather than boots on the ground. And I guess drones are probably better than sending 200,000 troops to Iraq. But
it depends how you see that, dude. I've
right.
read some stuff about like the psychology of people that live in Pakistan, the psychology of children living in an area where, because it used to be that like when bombs went off, you know, you saw there were airstrikes in which you saw the airplanes. You know, you kind of heard the airplanes, you knew bombs were coming. Drones are capable of delivering, just making anything explode at any moment.
Right.
And it was kind of like saying that this is putting like a psychological hex on a whole generation of young people who are just completely fucked from ever feeling stable or safe in anywhere they are.
In Gaza, there's Max Blumenthal, a journalist, talks about like there's just this constant low level hum of the cloud. The skies are blanketed with Israeli drones above Gaza all the time.
Yeah,
you know. If I had to make a choice between explicit colonialism and the neocolonialism of today, I guess I would choose neocolonialism, but that's like choosing diabetes over cancer, right?
Yeah, right.
It's true that like the horrors of the Belgians like having soldiers in the Congo were worse. But the thing about neocolonialism, right, is that it is durable. Like our current system that is sort of not explicitly colonialist. We don't have a lot of American troops like encamped in South American countries, but we do treat South American countries as colonial possessions. And the thing is, because we've hidden it, because we create this illusion of respectability, right, then it makes it harder to fight. One of the things that Trump threatens is the illusion of respectability, right? He is putting out there the nativism and racism that is already central to our system, right? So part of the reason why elites, and this is true for both some Republicans and some Democrats, part of the reason why elites hate Trump is because he is revealing what America actually is all about, right? And so if we beat him, okay, like obviously he's a monster. I don't want President Trump. But if you beat him and you get Hillary, and then you end up having again like the same totally destroyed, American labor movement, the complete inability to contain inequality, a capitalist class, a Wall Street class that you've demonstrated after the worst crisis you can imagine, and we still didn't have any meaningful reform. I mean, nobody went to jail, right? So I think that you could very clearly imagine a great big party again. We defeated fascism. All of our problems are solved. And you look around like, oh, wait, this is where we've always been. Yeah. Which is tremendously disappointing. And you said that,
that would be this. It would be status quo under Bernie Sanders as well. How are you positioning yourself as regards Bernie Sanders? I mean, for me, he seems like the only candidate that is saying anything worth listening to. But at the same time, it's like within the larger context, it's something sad about him running right now.
He is as good as it's going to get in my lifetime, and so I have been aggressive, as I always am, in prosecuting the case for him on Twitter and Facebook and with people I know face to face. I love many things about him. I love his political instincts, and I'd much rather have him in the race than not. And I think it's really beautiful and a moment to build something bigger to have this moment. Fundamentally, right, he's not actually a socialist in that he doesn't believe. To me, and I'm just one guy, who am I? But to me, the definition of socialism is that you have to believe, to one degree or another, in one way or another, the people have to take community control over the productive apparatus of society.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
There has to be communal ownership of the things that make the economy work, and that is not something that Bernie is proposing. It's also the case. I mean,
he's proposing a kinder, gentler capitalism,
right.
Which is, I mean, I feel like what he's proposing is to the right of the New Deal,
right? Yeah. And so, I mean, like, and this gets back to the whole thing. I mean, I don't want to get into a big theoretical debate here, but I think Bernie does fit in with, and again, like, it's great. Like, trust me, I'd love to have President Bernie Sanders, but.
I think we all agree on that. Yeah, I think that it's a really kind of tricky conversation to have.
Right. The thing is, Americans think that liberalism and conservatism are opposites. When in fact, liberalism is a species of conservatism, right? Because it exists in order to perpetuate the class hierarchy. It does it with savvier means, right? Like I agree with and will fight for and defend the programs of the New Deal that. Result in real material benefit for real people. But the New Deal came about because there was terror over the way that the American labor and socialist movements had changed the world. I mean, in the first half of the 20th century, American unions changed the working world forever.
Yeah.
It was unions who brought us the 8-hour workday. It was unions that brought us the weekend. It was unions that were able to do the most in terms of establishing safety and health standards inside places. It was unions that helped to sort of create systems of grievances to fight bosses. It was unions that applied upward pressure on wages. And that was very frightening for people in power, including people like FDR, who in every way imaginable was just another affluent bastard. You know what I'm saying? Like, I love a lot of the things that he did. I hate other things that he did, like, interning Japanese people.
He feels like, to me, like Mark Zuckerberg will be FDR eventually, right?
That's
like
exactly
that type
what
of figure. Yeah,
a kind of benevolent technocrat who really does have in his heart the idea that he's doing good things for people. But at the end of the day, the New Deal undercut the American socialist movement and the American labor movement because it established, hey, don't worry about, you don't have to have a powerful union. You don't have to organize at work. You don't have to form a socialist group. The liberal state will protect you. And so that's one of the things that, like, one of the worries about someone like Bernie is that by expanding what people get back, you still don't fundamentally change the distribution of power in the country. And that as long as that's true, the moneyed interests, the affluent, can be negotiated with to get more back, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what that is. Like, if we get more petty charity capitalism, if we get a child allowance, or if we get universal free college, that's great because that stuff helps people's real lives. But at the same time, it's still a negotiation with people who ultimately get to decide. So now I think that what we do is we don't say no Bernie, or we don't be cynics and say it's bad to organize around Bernie. We say this is the beginning of something. You take a presidential campaign, you harness the energy, you try your best to revitalize unions, even though everything has been against them. You have on the ground grassroots activism, and you create a durable movement that continues to push left. And you say, Bernie's the beginning and not the end.
That's the best case scenario.
That's the best case scenario. I am a pessimist by nature. And the thing about the left is, you should always bet on failure.
Yeah.
I mean, Adolf Reed says, that left-wing organizing, it's like being a hitter in baseball, which is if you get a hit a third of the time, they'll put you in the Hall of Fame. Right.
Right.
Like 1 out of 3 is like world class, right?
Yeah.
But all that cynicism aside, there is real anger in the streets right now because the system has fucked over us all over and over again. I mean, it is, people say, like, why are millennials all socialists? They were raised to be competitive with each other their whole lives. These kids go through high school, and it is absolutely cutthroat. From the day they show up at high school, they're told that in order for them to succeed, someone else has to fail. They are subject to this sort of, psychological assault of, like, status culture. They emerged from that status culture. They went to the right schools. They worked hard. They did what they said they were supposed to do. And they have sky-high unemployment, huge amounts of student loan debt. The system has failed them. Right?
Yeah.
The problem is, right now, we've got populist anger from there. But we've also got populist anger from a lot of scared working white-class people. White working-class people who have not shared in any of these gains either and who are being manipulated by a demagogue.
Yeah.
The best case scenario is the Bernie revolution. Even like he doesn't win, okay, that's fine. His movement starts to like do things like run in local and state elections, creates grassroots organizing, revitalizes the labor movement. We start to get like a Bernie Sanders Democrat in Congress.
Right.
You build something there. That's the best case. The worst case scenario is that it's Trump versus Clinton. Trump runs on an explicitly kind of economically populist message. That message is completely bullshit. I mean, I don't think that he has any actual economic populism. I think it's pure sort of demagoguery, and it's completely
politics.
It's just politics. Yeah, but that's his message, right? And you have
it's good politics, but there's no policy behind it.
So then what happens is that you already have this class of people who think of themselves as liberals, who are affluent, who went to Ivy League schools, and who already don't give much of a shit about economic justice. Like they think that left politics is all about like making sure that Marvel movies puts out enough black superheroes, right? Like that's their political orientation. So
or the Academy Awards nominate the appropriate representative amount of black people, which is not that that's not a problem. I mean, it's obviously a problem, but it's kind of weird to see like so much energy devoted to that.
I mean, of course, if we're going to be giving out golden statues to millionaires, I want that to be a diverse process, but like that is not what I would call a high priority for the left, right?
Yes.
So what happens then is you have a complete break, finally the beginning of a complete break between cultural and social liberalism and economic justice. Yeah. And that becomes self-reinforcing, right? Yeah. Because then those people say those sort of like, a Brown graduate who's in advertising here in Manhattan, who like lives a, kind of vaguely culturally kind of liberal kind of lifestyle and who says the right kind of words on Twitter.
Shops at Whole Foods.
Buys
the right stuff.
Is sexually libertine, like doesn't want anyone telling them not to have an abortion.
Cool with trans people,
but doesn't give a shit about like poor people.
Right.
And what happens is that person looks at Trump saying economic justice and they say, you see, the people who want economic justice are the racists in the neighborhood. And so I think the worst case scenario is we have a permanent realignment, or at least a long-term realignment of American politics, where the affluent people who kind of direct what the left wing is, like on Twitter and on Facebook, and that they win through a Trump versus Hillary Clinton contest, where economic justice becomes fully disentangled from its traditional place alongside racial and gender justice. That is, to me, is the nightmare scenario, because then there is no alternative but Hillary Clinton style neoliberalism.
Yeah. Right. And it creates lasting ideological splits that seem like that make it impossible to create the kind of solidarity needed to kind of create the politics we would want.
And that is the permanent victory for the affluent, right? Because rich people nowadays, some of them are still the kind of old school like, cultural and social liberals, like why are gays marrying? But in my experience, most of them are people who watch Broad City and who, love Kendrick Lamar and who say Yas Queen and, have all these vague kind of cultural signifiers of like vaguely liberal or progressive politics, but who just grew up kind of rich, went to the right schools, now make a lot of money, and they don't particularly want their tax rates high.
Or they think that's enough. Like they think that like I I have a shitty job where I make a lot of money, and when I say shitty, I mean a job that like hurts the rest of everyone. I make a lot of money. I work in finance or tech or something like that. But I listen to Kendrick Lamar, and that's like enough. Like that's enough to kind of absolve me of whatever position I've taken in the society. It's like my politics are clean because I know the right way to speak and I know the right music to listen to. I mean, even Obama listens to Kendrick Lamar.
Right. Yeah,
like,
and
that's like ruling class music.
And that's part of the reason why I focus so much.
Not that it's not awesome.
No, I mean the music is good. His music is awesome. Music is not culture, art, media, jokes. This is a big one.
Sure.
None of these things are the basis for a durable left-wing politics.
Unless Slavoj Žižek would disagree with you. He's big on the like racist joke. That's the like try.
Well, yeah. Slavoj is he does a really good job as being the court jester of Marxism. But like part of the reason why people get a little tired of how often I bang on about the symbolic element of sort of performative liberal politics.
Yeah.
But like it really is dangerous the way in which those broad cultural signifiers, right? I'm someone who listens to this music, likes this TV show. I use the word intersectional. I quote Spivak or whoever. I tweet. I use like the right terms to refer to trans people. I put the @ sign at the end of Latina or Latino, right?
Sure.
I have all these means in which I say to you, I am one of the good crew.
Yeah.
I'm part of your social and cultural milieu. So I'm a good guy or a good gal, but that never coalesces into anything like a meaningful, like political sort of statement that is devoted to tearing down class hierarchy.
Well, yeah, and it seems like it's a big phenomenon in the wider culture is that kind of idea that's just a misunderstanding of what politics actually is, and it goes back to even just the presidential election itself, and the kind of like seeing this like voting for Trump or voting for Clinton as your politics, when politics is something that happens every day. It's much more of a like a lived thing, and if we really wanted to change the world in the way that we want to change the world, it seems to have to move beyond representation. It have to move beyond that kind of like media, art, culture ideas. I think they're important. I think they drive things and are part of kind of how people understand who they are. But at the same time, it's not power.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess the where things come back together in a way that makes me a little bit hopeful is like reparations, which is a large subject. Mm-hmm. Reparations, for its various failings politically and for other reasons, it is fundamentally an acknowledgement of the fact that you can only redress racial inequality through structural economic means.
Right.
I think the danger right now is it's very important to a lot of people that kind of economic support is sort of racial, sort of specifically racial in its category. Mm-hmm. One thing I asked a lot of young lefties a lot right now is sort of like, okay, if I could prove to you that a broad system of redistribution that was meant for everybody, right, that helped poor white people as well as poor black people, if that actually had the effect of improving the lives of black people more relative to white people because black people are more often to be in poverty, which I think is true, would that be good enough for you? And a lot of them don't like that because what they think is really important is that you earmark these things as a sort of a specific category of racial justice. And on the one hand, I understand why people feel it's so important to speak specifically about the fact that racism is unlike any other kind of oppression, that it is wholly unique, that it is not reducible to class, that it is not merely an epiphenomenon of classism. I don't believe any of those things, and I think that that's important. But at the same time, a broad-based system of redistribution is not only, to me, the best way to ensure racial justice, it also is always going to be far more politically possible in a country where 70% of the electorate is white.
Yeah.
And but right now, it's just like, deference is this incredibly important political kind of idea right now, right? So, which is one of the things. So I get a lot of people yelling at me a lot, which is fine. I yell at people a lot myself, and I'm used to it.
Yeah, like digital yelling,
but also in real life. So I'm on a lot of different college campuses, and there's lots of passionate young people there with politics that are not like mine. And I get people yelling at me a lot. So one of the things that I do is I always say, when someone starts really to go in on me, I say, okay, let's stop for a second. What do you and I disagree about? Right. And also I'll say, what's a policy in which we disagree? I can't tell you how often I've asked that the other person couldn't name a specific thing. Right.
Yeah.
What they don't like is I don't perform a certain kind of deference to others.
Yeah.
Right? Because what they think, like
they read that as like mansplaining, white-splaining? Because I mean, you read as an FBI agent, right? Like visibly, I'm looking at you now, and I suspect that of you. So it's like there's and so there's the projection, right? Is that like you're the imperial figure that's coming here to like tell me that you're better than me, essentially, or you figured something out.
Right.
I mean, like I understand the like cultural basis of that defensiveness.
Right.
But yeah, at the same time, it's just kind of like fucking destroys any chance of us having a conversation.
It destroys any chance of us having a conversation. It destroys the fact that, again, like the reason that like the project is to create a cross-racial, cross-gender movement, right? In which we look at this much larger group of the have-nots, like realize that there's a lot of them, a lot more of them than the haves, right? Relatively speaking, and recognize that that's power and use that power to change the world, right? That is not just like a thing that I think is politically good, right? It's also something that could work.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. You wouldn't be pursuing it if you didn't think so.
Right, and there's like, I hear from, I know some, and by the way, they're almost all white. I know so many progressive people who seem to think that like there's something ennobling about talking about like pure race and antagonism. That somehow like you are a better anti-racist if you act like the interests of poor black people are always different from the interests of poor white people.
Right.
And it's like, okay, but like black people are what, 17% of the population, right? We're still a democracy, right? How are you going to convince the rest of the people, right? Like, and this notion that like, I mean, a lot of people on the progressive side of things seem to think that you can win politically in this country without appealing towards the white working class at all. And I think that like that's just like bad math.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then
on a fundamental level, bad math.
On a fundamental level, it's just like a failure of like addition, right?
Yes.
And I say that and people get so mad, right? And it, math can't be offensive, right?
Yeah.
How you interpret it can be. But yeah, and like this is connected to that.
And you're not talking about like that in order to move forward, we have to placate racists.
Right.
That's not what you're saying.
That's not the point. Right. Yeah. There's a ton of people in the Trump coalition who are just hardcore racists who suck. We'll never get them. Fine. Fuck them. Right. Now fuck them. But also like when we get about to implementing our agenda, right, after the revolution comes,
right.
and when we put a lot of people to the guillotine, it'll just so happen that life will get better for everybody.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's like, the point is it has to get better for everybody, or it gets no better for nobody. But the thing is, like, this connects to that question of deference, which is, I can perform. Look, I have all these tools, right? I know very well how I could speak and act in a way that would placate everybody. I mean, again, I fucking grew up at Wesleyan University. I know. It
explains so much about you. I'm so glad I learned that about you, because it explains so much of like your engagement with like the college kids and kind of that politics.
Like I grew up in this. I have a PhD in the humanities. Like I have all the codes, and I could get out in front of people. Like when I speak or when I go to these events, I could go and I could say, I could do all the deferring and I could perform that for people. The thing is, right now we've got people who are doing the performance digitally. They do all the deference. They make all the apologies. Well, I'm a white guy and they do all these things to sort of signal and perform that deference. But they are still people who are fundamentally perpetuating the status quo, right?
Yeah.
They work in finance. Then they go on Twitter and they talk about intersectionality. Like, no, you materially, you're part of the problem.
Yeah.
And one of the major problems for the left right now is mistaking that affective stance of deference to other people for something that matters, right?
Yeah.
And I'd so much rather have somebody who's kind of an asshole, who risks being a mansplainer, right? Who risks white-splaining.
Or Marx-splaining or whatever.
Or Bernie broing or whatever, if that person is actually committed to the politics that's going to help the most people.
Yeah,
right? And that's the problem, is this growing division between the affective stance of being one of the good ones and the actual sort of material politics that you subscribe to.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end. Freddie deBoer, thank you so much for joining me. It was great having you. I've learned a lot from your blog. I find your blog really one of the things I like about it is there's a weird kind of agnosticism to it. Like there's sometimes like this admission that I could be wrong here, or maybe I'm being too pessimistic, or maybe I'm being too optimistic. But either way, I really appreciate your writing, and I really appreciate you coming by.
Thanks. I've never minded being an asshole. I want to be a certain kind of asshole.
Yeah. No, I think that's important. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.